Absolutely. It requires pressure, it requires active engagement, and sometimes also you have to sue the bastards.
Esteemed guests and viewers from all over the world, welcome to Facing Future TV and Climate Finance or Failure at COP28 from Dubai, UAE. In an era where the intersection of finance and environmental sustainability is pivotal, this session promises a profound exploration of the intricacies surrounding the funding of climate action and sustainable development initiatives. The esteemed panelists, well-versed in the dynamics of climate finance, will guide us through discussions on leveraging and innovative financial systems and mechanisms to bolster the fight against climate change. Our focus will be on equitable and effective financing strategies with a framework on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as striving to distinguish between impactful solutions and potential pitfalls. Join us as we navigate the critical dialogue on how financial strategies can be the linchpin of a global pursuit of environmental sustainability. As an introduction now of our guests, we have Mr. Tom Goldtooth, who is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Environmental Network, working for the rights of Indigenous people, rights of Mother Earth, and for environmental and economic justices. We have Ms. Raya Salter, the founder and Executive Director of the Environmental Justice Law and Policy Center. She's also an attorney, author, and activist, and member of the New York State Climate Action Council. Mr. Dan Galpern, who's an environmental and climate attorney and policy analyst, who since 2011 has served as a legal and policy advisor to the climate scientist James E. Hansen, including with respect to administrative, criminal, and civil state and federal actions in many U.S. jurisdictions. First, we'd like to hear from Tom.
Thank you. The UN, the World Bank, and other multilateral development banks are colonial institutions whose work reproduces colonial legacies of dispossession and inequality. It's very critical from the indigenous lens, not only where I come from Minnesota, state of Minnesota in the United States, but in consultation with many indigenous peoples worldwide. The relationship here is still one of extraction. Institutions engaging in climate finance, mitigation, adaptation finance, loss and damage, and the banks choose projects basically on their ability to generate profit and maximize private sector involvement. Climate change is simply treated as the newest arena for capitalism, financial expansion, and development, once again entrenching the dynamic of exploitation and violence from the global north under the guise of helping the global south. This is history repeating itself. It is the same development paradigm that contributed to the climate crisis in the first place, this time with even less accountability, but a greener image. Climate finance and funding mechanisms do nothing to address the root cause of climate change. They do not reduce emissions at source, nor keep fossil fuels in the ground. There is no accountability mechanism led by indigenous peoples and local communities to ensure that projects, in fact, do really address climate change. The solutions pushed under the UNFCCC are false solutions that actively perpetuate the climate crisis. This includes reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or what we call REDD+. Nature-based solutions, carbon trading, carbon offsets, climate-smart agriculture, and the global 30 by 30 conservation and biodiversity offset schemes, and geoengineering techno-fixes such as the Arctic Ice Project, carbon capture and storage, and solar radiation modification and manipulation. You cannot manage these precious nature systems that I'm talking about, the sacredness of Mother Earth. The push to financialize climate and to create large climate funds within development and financial institutions skirts around real solutions. They distract from the root causes of climate change and allow polluters to keep on polluting. while indigenous peoples and local communities continue to face the violent land grabs and environmental, social, health, and cultural disposition and genocide of climate change, and including the ecocide and terroricide of Mother Earth and Father Sky. Moreover, in conclusion, governments, multilateral development banks, financial institutions, and the private sector use climate finance initiatives and funds that allow polluters and exploitative financial institutions to continue with business as usual. But it does create a false sense of hope and acts as a distraction of the attention needed to push for real solutions led by indigenous peoples and local communities. Therefore, to address global climate inequality, strategies for systemic change must center indigenous peoples, our self-determination, our sovereignty, our indigenous jurisprudence, our legal systems based upon the natural laws, our jurisdictional authorities with whatever nation state that we reside in that protects our territorial rights, our demarcation of our ancestral lands, our traditional knowledge, and keeping it in the ground, and true reparations not only for our indigenous peoples, but also those populations of local communities. For an example, in North America, the Black and people of color peoples. So the focus of these talks around Article 6 here at the UNFCCC must be centered on phasing out fossil fuels at source with the environmental, social justice, and a rights-based perspective, not false solutions like abated fossil fuels, carbon dioxide removals, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, nuclear, are misguided and dangerous geoengineering technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for your partnership and your attention on this. Obviously, indigenous communities play a massive role in the protection of the environment, and we look forward to hearing from you later in the program. Raya, let's turn to you. Opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Tom. Tom has long been a giant and a leader in the climate justice movement, and it's a hard act to follow. And what I want to talk about today, and again, I want to discuss some more about this idea of false solutions, are how the United States is financing, finance mechanisms are forwarding them, namely the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, that is really driving unprecedented investments into the false solutions that Tom just discussed. And I want you to understand the scale of these investments, and I also want to stress that this is a ship that sailed, and that what it really means is that the United States, the world's top oil producer and largest historical emitter, really is not on track to rein in the fossil fuel industry and keep it in the ground, and that's what we know is needed if we're truly going to address the climate crisis. So what are false solutions? Mr. Goldtooth spoke to some of them, and very briefly I will outline just a few as they relate to oil and gas. So one that was mentioned, carbon capture and storage. This idea that as you're extracting and producing fossil fuels, that you can capture these emissions and prevent them from going into the atmosphere. Something that is not technologically feasible at mass scale and has never actually been shown to work at scale as promised. The idea of clean or green hydrogen, which is really carbon and energy intensive methods to derive hydrogen from electrolysis. While there are some instances where research and development on clean hydrogen can be beneficial, there are many, including hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, that just are not. Nuclear power, of course, the entire lifespan of nuclear energy is one of high cost, enormous risk, and massive contamination. And I'll also mention biofuels, because what we're talking about is locking in combustion. Biofuels speed up deforestation, they take land and water resources, and they increase local food costs. So what was the Inflation Reduction Act? $395 billion invested into climate. Yes, the largest investment into climate in U.S. history. And because of the way it was structured as being largely tax incentives, it's actually much more than $395 billion. Goldman Sachs has estimated that it's actually a cost to the U.S. government of up to $1.2 trillion. And while there have been many investments in clean and renewable energy, it is also supercharging investments into false solutions and created an incredibly exuberant market for them. So we've seen an explosion in investments over the past 2 years in clean and renewable energy, but also in these false solution technologies, 75% increase in 2 years since the Inflation Reduction Act. And what this means is that those who are communities who are impacted by the extraction and transport of fossil fuels are going to continue to be harmed. Fossil fuel extraction will expand and will not be mitigated as promised. And so folks who are impacted by the fossil fuel industry will continue to see those same impacts. And just in July, ExxonMobil announced a $4.9 billion carbon capture and storage project in the United States. And this is just one of many, many announcements. Again, these technologies have never worked. They have never been proven. They have never worked at the scale at which they're promised. And the idea here is that we are putting research and development into an area that's really an enabling technology for the fossil fuel industry, when we could be making these large-scale investments into clean and renewable technology. The last thing I'll mention is that in addition to the finance mechanism through taxes, the United States is also creating the regulatory glide path needed for these technologies. So just this summer, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, announced rules that will effectively create a carbon capture standard for power plants in the United States. So this is something that is being exported to the world. It's an idea that's being talked about right now in these halls. And the thing to remember, just as Tom Goldtooth said, is that if we are not addressing fossil fuel extraction and keeping it in the ground, we are not addressing the climate crisis.
Wondering if you could go a little bit more in further detail about the mobilization of New York's climate finance arm and how it's helped push proposals that you think are false solutions, and where you think that money could have been better allocated, and maybe some of the arms and vehicles that you've seen success in New York's fight for a just and equitable transition.
Thank you for that, Carlos. And what Carlos is referring to is in 2019, New York passed landmark climate legislation. It was called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It created a Climate Action Council to create New York State's glide path for how we'd reach our climate goals. And I spent almost 4 years sitting on that council working on these policies. And one thing I can say is that one reason I like to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is doing a lot of good things, is that the powering of false solutions really came into that Climate Action Council process in the late hours and inserted more pink hydrogen, this idea of making hydrogen from nuclear energy, into the process, and has, the money that has come into these processes is really setting us back in terms of actually making progress on keeping it in the ground. We don't frack in New York State because of activists in New York State, and we're getting a lot of pushback, and it's problematic. Another thing that's rolling forward out of that process is cap and invest, which is just another way to say cap and trade. And there are a lot of concerns about that as well. Although it can raise money for clean and renewable projects, there's also the danger that we will once again not actually reduce emissions at source.
And I think as well, right, in New York, there's a couple different proposals for that cap and invest, and I think the biggest part is where does the money go to, right? I think the ISO, the grid operator, had an idea of giving that money back to the utilities, and I think some of the community groups said, no, we want it to go back to the communities, right? Yeah,
any sort of cap and trade system, if it's revenue neutral, that means that all the funds that come in, go back out to the folks who it's been charged to. And certainly activists want to see a lot of those funds go towards helping low-income ratepayers and also towards clean energy projects.
Yeah. Tom, I want to go back to you now. So you mentioned the consistent promotion of extractive climate finance solutions in your indigenous communities and members alike. When we look at the Inflation Reduction Act and we see the intention of the U.S. government to provide a lot a lot of support to indigenous communities in the form of promotion, saying, companies, if you want to invest in indigenous communities, you actually get a promotion. You don't get as much tax burden and you get tax incentives for it. But as you're saying, there's a lot of promotion of extractive climate finance solutions. So I'm wondering if you can maybe share some examples of some regenerative, non-extractive climate partnerships within the indigenous communities in the climate finance kind of tech world that you've seen successfully bridging the indigenous community and environmental climate energy space divide?
If you visit our webpage, ienearth.org, you'll see an initiative that we've developed called the Indigenous Principles of Just Transition. We have been part of the civil society groups in the U.S. of Black and people of color, but also workers years ago, and developed a Just Transition Alliance, bringing together the fence line and the workers concerned about pollution generation and release of pollutants. So we have some history in that. And as Just Transition continued to become popular, especially in the 2014 People's Climate March in New York City, it seemed to have been taken over by the white environmental organizations and redefined to fit their agenda. So in that meantime, we had to regroup. And for indigenous people, or who we call American Indians and Alaska Natives in the United States, we ask ourselves, what do we mean by just transition? So part of that is solution-based. In fact, we provided a lot of education on the Hill, as we call it in the U.S., where legislation is developed in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., I mean, okay. And there's a number of bills that came up with money, not quite as tight as we wanted, but there are monies in the IRA and some other legislation that became law that has generated money for tribes. For an example, we've been advocating for our over 567 something tribes to be able to make their own transition away from their own dependency on fossil fuels. I mean, that was something that's been advocated by the U.S. government through the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Around renewable and clean energy, for an example. Solar systems, wind power, there's tremendous reports that have been filed of how we can generate not only for meeting the energy needs for our sovereign nations back home, but also for the rest of America. We have that much available as a resource. So there's many other positive initiatives. There is, as you're hearing here as an audience, the media, there is the good, bad, and ugly of the IRA legislation. So we are also focused on the good, but taking on the bad. So thank you.
Yeah, Tom, one thing, as someone who lives in DC and helped work on the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I will say that the only person who will say that a bill or a law is perfect is a politician. And so I think I agree with you in that it's pretty tough to navigate all the complexities and all the negative externalities or positive externalities of maybe a well-intentioned or maybe unwell-intentioned bill, but I think we're all trying to dig into the billions of dollars that were accessed through IRA. Dan, I want to leave the last few remarks with you, wondering how you make sense of all this. You've got indigenous communities who, rightfully so, are angry and feel disenfranchised and feel left behind and feel like they aren't being well accounted for in the just transition. You've got states like New York that are writing laws that are some of the most ambitious in the world and trying to make sense of how the economics are going to play into the private sector, competitiveness side of it. From the legal side and everything you're kind of hearing, how are you making sense of all this? What's the right way forward?
I can't really say that in just a couple of minutes, but I will offer one way to think about it. And that is with a question, who should pay to clean up this mess? Should it be, for example, the taxpayers? That's how we're doing it through the IRA, right? taxpayer funding for 45Q, IRS code for paying for research and not only research, but actual carbon removals. Who's paying for that? The taxpayer. Or all this money that's going to direct air capture hubs or carbon capture and storage. And who benefits from that? Well, for example, one of the major beneficiaries from a lot of these subsidies will be the oil industry, because the CO2 that would be captured is most readily utilized for enhanced oil recovery, including in the Permian Basin. Not what most people think of for a strong climate bill. And what tools do we have to ensure that the polluters actually pay, and they actually pay to clean up their mess? Well, there are, as I started to explain, a number of tools in existing law. Should those communities that traditionally have been most disenfranchised and in fact have received the greatest burden from localized pollution, should they be part of the solution? Of course they should. They should be made whole. When EPA proposes rules, they should ensure that they're having public hearings not only in the major cities, but in local areas, so that there's a potential for participation by local and indigenous communities. So we need to do a lot better to involve those who have most been burdened by the pollution, and we need to actually utilize the tools that we have available, including our existing bedrock environmental statutes.
Thank you for that, Dan. And one thing that I always find incredibly interesting, the just transition movement was actually born out of Michigan in the 70s from chemical workers whose EPA regulations were starting to put out of business, and they were saying, you have government that is well-intentioned and trying to protect the people, but you have a whole industry that is based on it, and you have livelihoods, and you've got real consequences for some of the policies. How are we going to make sure that the policies that are well-intentioned and that do good don't also do harm at the same time? And I think it's interesting how it's changed a little bit from those white workers in Michigan, and now we're trying to really understand the full scope of this transition.
Absolutely. It requires pressure, it requires active engagement, and sometimes also you have to sue the bastards.
Raya, I want to give you the last word here since you were so kind. And I think you have a couple people to thank as well, right?
Yes, sure. So thanks to Facing Future TV and also the International Society for Ecological Economics.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and we look forward to discussing these really important topics with you all over the next 2 weeks. Thank you.